Greetings and welcome back to Room 303 in our Talks with Walt as we move through the deathbed edition of Leaves of Grass. We turn now to Song of Myself, Passage 8. Now many have seen Passage 8 through 16 as the great cataloging grouping. We're going to talk about Whitman as journalist and his capacity to see. He's quite remarkable. We're going to pay attention to that here. Now my assumptions are you've been following our stuff at LearnStrong.net, our inscriptions discussions, our starting from Paumanok. We're going to have seen some of this in Paumanok where he's going to just tell us all the different things that he sees. And of course I'm hoping you've been with us for the preceding Song of Myself lectures 1 through 7. I'm not going to read this in its entirety. I'm just going to go ahead and start and jump right in. Let's pay attention to all the amazing things that he sees. Now, if you're going to be a good writer, as we've said many times in 303, you're going to learn to show and not tell. Let's pay attention to the way he does that. The little one sleeps in its cradle. I lift the gauze and look a long time and silently brush away flies with my hand. Notice the genius of the imagery here. The little one sleeps. We're going to see a poem called Sleepers later. The Sleepers is going to be a lot of fun for us to study. And of course, we've heard about children. Earlier in 6, of course, a child was asking questions about the grass. And of course, children were being taken from their mother's laps, and now the earth becomes the mother's laps. Here it's a different kind of cradle. It's a different sleeping. Out of the cradle endlessly rocking will also be a poem that we'll come back to later. I lift the gauze, notice, and look. We're going to see different words for look, witness, view, and a long time. In other words, I'm willing to look at this and then silently brush away flies with my hand. It's a brilliant, brilliant image, and it's the little things that make Whitman so great. The youngster and the red-faced girl turn aside up the bushy hill. I peeringly view them from the top. The idea of young love. By the way, red-faced in the 1855 was one word combined and then hyphenated. And then a very disturbing image, the suicide. And then look at his use of verbs. The suicide sprawls on the bloody floor of the bedroom. I witness the corpse with its dappled hair. I note where the pistol has fallen. Now, there's a number of editings from the 1855 edition. I can't go into all of them. I recommend that you study these two alongside. But we're going to have a different verbiage in the 1855 with the past tense of witness to witnessed, the corpse, and then there's ellipsis, and then with its dappled hair, I note, is not in the original version, but there the pistol has fallen. This dappled hair added, obviously, even a more compelling image. We then will go to some discussions of what he sees in the city. Of course, probably, most likely, New York. He uses great verbiage, like the blab of the pave, for pavement, right? Tires of carts, slough of boot soles. We're going to hear more about boots, obviously, at the conclusion of Song of Myself. Talk of the promenaders, the heavy omnibus. Whitman loved to sit alongside these drivers he's going to reference. The driver with his interrogating thumb. What a great image that is. The clank of the shod horses on the granite floor. Now, I've commented on the ways that I think that Whitman has influenced T.S. Eliot. Go back and look at Four Quartets, at T.S. Eliot's Four Quartets, and notice the use of words like clangs the bell, here it's clank, right, of the shod horses of the granite floor. All 5 senses being elicited. His use, obviously, of onomatopoeia and all of that as well is all here to be. The snow sleighs, clinking, shouted jokes, pelts of snowballs. He's just capturing images, right? The hurrahs of popular favorites, the fury of roused mobs. Whitman obviously witnessing this, having lived through, ultimately, the Civil War that's coming. The flap of the curtained litter, and then a sick man inside, borne to the hospital. Of course, Whitman will know about that from his time during the Civil War. The meeting of enemies, the sudden oath, the blows and fall. You get a sense that he has seen maybe a fight or two in his life. The excited crowd, we're back, of course, to the roused mobs. The excited crowd, the policeman with his star. It's brilliant, just an amazing eye. Quickly working his passage to the center of the crowd, the courage, of course, that it takes for law enforcement to step into these situations, which is why we always want to pay our proper respect to law enforcement officials for the fact that they do show up in really dangerous situations, and they're the ones that are asked to go to the center of the crowd where they're obviously most vulnerable. The impassive stones that receive and return so many echoes. You can do worse than go through all of Leaves of Grass and every time there's the mention of echoes or a reverberation of a kind, either directly or indirectly, and write it down. It's amazing how it just keeps coming back. Like, for example, starting with the infant in a cradle and, of course, the child of passage 6. And then there's a line that's taken out in the deathbed edition that was in the 1855, which is why many readers love the original 1855 of Song of Myself often much better than the edited version. This line runs like this: the soul's moving along, then there's an ellipsis, and then an interesting rhetorical question: are they invisible while the least atom of the stones is visible? It's an amazing line, and we don't really know exactly why Whitman made some of the decisions he made with editing. And then, what groans of overfed or half-starved, who falls sunstruck or in fits. It's an amazing thing to put overfed and half-starved together. In other words, Whitman sees both sides of the theodicy question, doesn't he? When exclamations of women taken suddenly who hurry home and give birth to babes, we begin with an infant, we end with infants. What living and buried speech is always vibrating here? Of course, I Hear America Singing immediately comes to mind from inscriptions. What howls, we'll think of Allen Ginsberg's classic, what howls restrained by decorum. It's funny, of course, that Whitman would talk about decorum, given that he himself is probably not given much to decorum, the way one is supposed to behave, right? But the city, we see this all the time. Obviously, at 3A, we can write down Sandburg's Chicago as a classic example that Sandburg will obviously have been influenced by a set of lines like this to celebrate the city, both sides, right? Arrests of criminals, we're back to law enforcement. Slights, that is to say, people who will ignore or people who will in fact insult. Adulterous offers made, obviously there's a whole lot of this that goes on for Whitman as he sees it in the city. Acceptances, rejections with convex lips. He's going to have a whole poem to a prostitute, which will, of course, make Leaves of Grass Deathbed Edition very controversial for celebrating these kinds of women. And yet, for Whitman, all of these people are of equal value to him. Notice how he says it, sounding very much like in passage 5 when he says, I mind how one June summer day, I mind them or the show. Remember in passage 5 he called it the game, right? Or earlier in passage 4-5, the game, or resonant of them. Now this echo or this resonance of the game, constant through the next several passages, is why I'm pointing it out. And then the dash, which in the original 55 edition was just an ellipsis, but he uses the dash here. It looks very much like Emily Dickinson's use of the dash. And then he finishes passage 8 with, I come, which is of course one of the important words of Leaves of Grass, the very first word, right, of Leaves of Grass, and I depart. Now this is pure Whitman. The idea that I'm going to show up, I'm going to look at some things, and then I'm going to leave. I'm going to leave you alone. Of course, he doesn't use the word depart. He doesn't use the word leave, he uses the word depart, but of course we know that that word leave is always standing in Leaves of Grass as the title. And to that degree, we're really playing around at 3A with the idea of Aristotle in Poetics, that what is it that he said great art does? It's like a mirror. Remember, this is what Hamlet says in that famous speech of the play Hamlet, as those guys are getting ready to perform the play within the play. What is it that he says? Great art is like a mirror that you hold up to the audience, and what is it? They see themselves reflected back. This is exactly what Whitman wants to do. It's exactly what James Joyce will do in his short story collection, Dubliners. It is what Joyce himself said he was doing, and I think Joyce very influenced by Whitman. At 2A, of course, life is both pain as well as joy. We just have to be able and willing to see it, to witness it, to view it, are all those words he uses. At 2B, well, obviously the anaphoria. Notice that repetition of that cataloging, that listening. We're going to see much, much more of it. At 3A, I've mentioned T.S. Eliot, but really who we should mention is Dante. I think Dante very much influenced this listing, all the things I see. Of course, Whitman himself, as we said, was a journalist. He saw a lot. He was a great watcher. He was a great listener, as all great artists are. And then finally, at 3B, and we'll ask this question a number of times through the next few sections. Of all the things that he says he sees, the child sleeping in the cradle, and he slowly, gently brushes away flies, the suicide with the pistol on the floor, the sprawled suicide. What are the images for you that are the most powerful, and why? What is it that makes this kind of imagery so good? Hey guys, we have said, if you want to be a good writer, you have to be a good reader. One of the reasons, I mean there's a lot of them, that we're playing this game of Talks with Walt, but one of those reasons is so that we can learn how to better watch a great watcher, if you get my drift. In other words, we're going to pay attention to the way Whitman plays this game, and then we ourselves as writers will learn to play the same game. Challenge for you. And this is a kind of Natalie Goldberg writing down the bones or wild mind kind of activity. Both of those texts of Goldberg are very, very famous in 303 for the following reason. Take a walk through the halls of our school, or take a walk through the town, or take a walk through a city, and just watch. And then try and write about the things that you see, paying particular attention to your verbs and to your adjectives. Of course, your adverbs too, but to pay attention to the way you want to describe, in as little words as possible, what it is that you're seeing. Well, we'll continue with passage 9 and more of the same. All the things that Whitman can see. It's quite a remarkable thing. Thank you.